Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Harald Hardrada, Viking Mercenary Part 1 by History Dose. So this reaction was requested by one of our wonderful patrons. If you would like to see exclusive reaction content or request any reactions, please check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. I'm excited to get into Harald Hardrada, one of the most famous Vikings of history. I don't know too much about him, so I'm really excited to learn about this man. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
This episode is brought to you by mine. Stick around to the end to discover which companies have your personal data and how you can reclaim it. The king's sharp sword lies clean and bright, prepared in foreign lands to fight. Our ravens croak to have their fill. The wolf howls from the distant hill.
Damn, okay. The Banished King.
The forest-dwelling peasantry glimpsed that feared man. Here was the exiled King Olaf, returned from the land of the Rus to take back the throne of Norway. At his side was his half-brother, the strong Harald Sigurdsson, 15 years of age. On the path, vagabonds joined their army, and this force settled on a small hill at a place called Stiklestad. And at once they perceived the clamor of another army, led by a man who once served Olaf, Kulf Arnason. He now marched on behalf of the usurper king Canute the Great, who ruled over Denmark, England, and this kingdom of Norway.
God damn! Now look, there was a lot of competition over the Norse or the Viking throne at this point. There were a lot of capable warriors leading armies, and not only were they fighting over that throne, they were fighting over thrones across Europe. It really is remarkable. And we'll see some of this in Harald's story, how much the Vikings got around in this time period. You look at a bunch of different European countries and kingdoms, and you will see Vikings getting involved. So, a tough bunch, I'll put it that way.
Men howled summons to Christ, others to Odin, and the two armies fell upon each other in fury. Olaf's position was overrun. Stray limbs and corpses trailed slick upon the hill. An enemy stabbed young Harald, and King Olaf was impaled. And so recorded the Norse lore. King Olaf fell upon a stone, and he called out to God as he clutched at the spear which quivered in his abdomen. And he looked up to see Kulf Arnason, who duly cut Olaf's throat. Soldiers scattered. Kulf and his men stalked the body hills, killing the wounded. The bleeding Harald gathered to his feet and stole into the wilderness, staggering through the thick until he came to a hovel. Therein a kindly peasant family received him and tended to his wounds by firelight. Harald healed there for some days, but he could not tarry, for the black winter would soon turn the woods bitter and block the high passes east. So Harald wrapped himself in a red cloak, and the peasant's son showed him the way into the mountains.
Talk about a cinematic story. This reads more like a fantasy novel than an actual historical biography. And I don't know how much of this is embellished, but a pretty remarkable way to start the video, I'll say that.
Straying from the main roads, the intrepid prince wandered over quiet peaks, and avoiding bandit hideouts, he passed into old and heathen woods, where legend said lived giants and trolls. Harald came finally to Sweden, and finding other survivors from Stiklestad, he wintered there, rallied some strong allies, and departed Scandinavia.
Foreign lands to fight. And like I said, we're going to see some of that Viking exploring spirit in Harald's story. All the different places he gets to. pretty representative of the Vikings as a whole.
Harald and his warriors passed in dragon ships before quiet wooden towns and humble cathedrals. Their forebears had once come to this land of the Rus to slaughter and plunder, for the age of the Viking had begun 2 centuries before. Norse chiefs had gathered the bravest sons of Odin to burn, loot, and enslave all the coasts of Europe. But here the Norse had also settled, and along with local Slavs and Finnic peoples, they established a vast state called the Kievan Rus.
Yeah, and this is absolutely worth pointing out. So, of course, we know about the Vikings going around Europe, raiding shores from England to France and beyond. But the Vikings did sometimes settle, and we have a couple of examples of that. We have the Kievan Rus, that would grow to be a very powerful and prominent people. We have the Vikings that settled in Normandy, the Normans, who then, mixed with the local French population. Of course, they will become a very notable people. We might see some of them later in this video or in part 2. So we have examples of Vikings raiding European shores up and down, settling in different places throughout Europe, and serving as mercenaries throughout Europe, and frankly, even a little bit beyond. So they really had a variety of influences throughout the continent.
In Scandinavia, too, the days of the old gods and petty clans were waning. Men like Olaf and Canute had made Christian kings of themselves and brought war against those fractious heathen chieftains. And yet Odin's raven flew still on the royal banners, and the cruel axes of Norsemen were feared in every realm. Thus, Harald and his men endeavored here to become mercenaries. Passing through the lofty gates of Novgorod or Kiev, Harald came to the court of the Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, to whom he relayed sorrowful word of Olaf's demise. For it was Yaroslav who had provided sanctuary for Olaf in his exile, and still present in this court were Olaf's mistress and his illegitimate son, Magnus. Yaroslav welcomed Harald and sent the prince and his warriors first into the boglands of Poland, where they slew enemy Poles and destroyed their dwellings. In this manner, Harald sharpened his axe against the prince's enemies for years, earning glory and blood money as he went. He finally proposed that Yaroslav betroth him to his child daughter, the Kievan princess Elisaveta, but Yaroslav refused. For Harald, at roughly 18 years of age, remained a brave but crownless leader among the king's officers, and he possessed neither land nor riches. In 1034, 2 Norwegians arrived in Kievan Rus, bitter enemies of the late Olaf, the corpulent Einar Thumbar-Skelfir, and Kolf Arneson.
Kolf is back.
King Canute was being overthrown in Norway, and they had come to collect a suitable successor. Not Harald, so strong of will, but the impressionable child Magnus. Harald did not possess the men nor the riches to challenge all these enemies.
Yeah, Harald has a long way to go. I mean, he's clearly skilled, he's brave, he's determined, but, you need a certain prestige, a certain authority that Harald doesn't quite have. Especially if you're, say, a powerful Viking warrior. Who do you want to put on the throne? Well, if you want to control them, someone weak, someone who you can sort of puppeteer from above, not necessarily someone hard-willed like Harald.
To take the throne he so desired, yet he had heard of distant lands filled with fabled treasures to be won in glorious battles. And so Harald gathered a few hundred men and sailed far south.
Yep.
The sun shone white against heavenward crosses and fell smoothly down the domes and aqueducts, scattering into shadows against houses and canopied streets. When Rome fell to the barbarians in the times of old and the western glory waned, it was this city that kept alight the flame of that ancient empire. This was Constantinople, the heart of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire.
Now look, the Eastern Roman Empire has fallen a bit. It isn't what it once was. I mean, of course you have the collapse of the West, Then Justinian reclaims some of that western territory, then a lot of that territory is taken by the Arabs, so not as impressive as the Roman Empire once was. The Byzantine Empire is one amongst several empires, but still an impressive player on the world stage, and Constantinople still a very impressive and prosperous city, and you can read accounts from a lot of the merchants or courtiers who visited Constantinople from other places throughout Europe. Even at this time, they were still impressed by the city, and Harold is heading there like many other Vikings had to serve. And we'll get into that a little bit later.
Harold pushed through the city. Magnificent forums clattered with the wares of merchants from afar, and there were foul streets lined by groaning beggars and brothels. Harold approached the palace and enlisted in the Varangian Guard, the ranks of storied Norse mercenaries prized by these Byzantines.
There we go, the Varangian Guard, formed, or first officially constituted, I believe, under Basil II, Basil the Bulgar Slayer, I think in the 870s, the late 800s, originally primarily Rus mercenaries, but over time, just Norse or Viking mercenaries more broadly. The idea of the Varangian or the Varangian Guard for the emperor was that he wanted this personal bodyguard that wasn't necessarily involved in Byzantine politics. They were from a far way away. They were loyal to whoever was paying them, aka the emperor. And so they would ideally not get involved in any of the local court politics, political intrigues, and these mercenaries would be loyal to whoever they served. That's the whole idea of the Varangian Guard. And at this point, like they said, many storied Norse warriors had served, so it was a good place to go.
As loyal bodyguards and elite infantry. It was Varangians who guarded the throne, where sat Emperor Michael IV, and by his side the fair Empress Zoe, more than 30 years his senior. Only months before, Michael had been merely the low-born lover of the Empress. It was widely believed that the pair orchestrated the murder of her husband, Emperor Romanus III. They married the very day he died. Harold and his men were welcomed here, for a grave threat afflicted this empire. The Islamic Fatimid Caliphate ruled the Holy Land and much of the southern Mediterranean, and of late thousands of Muslim corsairs from Islamic Sicily and Tunisia began to assail the shores of Christendom, raiding villages, killing the men, and stealing women and children into slavery.
Yep, and like I said, we talk about the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. One of the major threats to the existence of the Eastern Roman Empire was the Caliphate, of course beginning in sort of the mid-600s, taking many different forms. We have the Rashidun Caliphate, Umayyad, Abbasid, Fatimid. Whichever one you're talking about, the Caliphate had for a long time been a thorn in the side of the Byzantine Empire, and in the first couple years of the Caliphate's existence, it had served as a serious threat to the survival of the empire. Now, of course, it's been about 400 years since that point, and the Byzantine Empire has survived, but it is still threatened on multiple sides by multiple enemies, but in this case, by the Caliphate and its raiders.
To those burning coasts, the emperor now sent his fleet. Byzantine ships careened after the pirates and unleashed howling streams of Greek fire. Some of the pirates perished in the infernal winds. Others would have raised their scimitars in defense, only to be met by the rageful Harold and his Vikings grappling aboard with two-handed axes. They annihilated the pirates on the ships they captured, and joined the Byzantine land campaign to brutally conquer and subjugate Muslim-held towns along the imperial borders. The Fatimids responded with equal force, massacring and enslaving Christian towns, and then they brokered peace with Michael IV. Their terms permitted Christians to rebuild the sacred Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, destroyed by the Fatimids a few decades before when their caliph had, for a time, forced Christians to convert to Islam. It was written that Harold joined the imperial delegation on a long and arid journey across the desert, until at last they beheld the Holy Land.
Wow.
The Byzantines toured the hallowed shrines of Jerusalem, walked the pilgrim-trodden path of the crucifixion. Harald made use of his axe butchering bandits who stalked their caravan.
And that must be quite a sight to see. I mean, you can imagine from the perspective of these medieval Christians to get this opportunity, that would have been a big deal. Now, sometimes we think about, the formation of the caliphate and then, the Holy Land was cut off to Christians. Not necessarily true. I mean, remember, there were many different caliphates and many different Muslim states that controlled this territory throughout time. Sure, sometimes Christians weren't able to travel to the Holy Land, but a lot of pilgrims were able to make it from a variety of European states to the Holy Land to perform their pilgrimages and pray and do all that sort of stuff. It sort of depended on who was in charge at that time. And to be honest, what a lot of these caliphs or emperors or Muslim rulers would realize, as most other rulers realize, is that if you want to run a big, diverse empire, it's probably better to have some degree of toleration. You can try and force all Jews, Christians, etc. to convert, but that's probably going to cause a lot of trouble for you, so it might be easier if you just allow some level of religious toleration. And so, like I said, at a lot of points throughout the medieval era, it was possible in one way or another to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, though it was, of course, very expensive. You needed a lot of resources to do it, so still a pretty rare opportunity.
And later stopped to bathe in the River Jordan. Now in his 20s, Harald came to command the Varangians with stern ferocity. He joined the Byzantine invasion of Islamic Sicily and was said to have ended a siege by tunneling under the walls of a city with his Varangians and slaying the garrison. In all his conquests, he plundered greedily and amassed a hoard of foreign treasure. But all was not well in this empire. Prayers rang out in the gilded churches of Constantinople. Dark days lay ahead.
Last days of the Emperor.
All could see the Emperor was ailing, his flesh swelled, and he was beset by violent seizures. He adopted his nephew Michael as his son and named him as his successor. Some were wary of the younger Michael. One monk recalled, "He concealed a wicked nature under a benign front. He was adept at scheming and plotting." Yet the Emperor still lived, and he summoned Harald to claim some final glory at his side and crush a revolt among the Bulgars. And so together they laid waste to the rebel towns.
And when I talked about how the Byzantine Empire experiences threats from several directions, probably their biggest threat to the east or the south for hundreds of years now was the Caliphate, and their biggest threat to, I suppose, the north or the west was Bulgaria. Once again, that relationship was sort of up and down. Sometimes the Bulgars and the Byzantines were allies, sometimes they were enemies, sometimes the Byzantine Empire had the upper hand, sometimes the Bulgars posed a serious threat to Constantinople itself. So they were definitely quite the threat.
Capturing a rebel king who had had his eyes plucked and nose cut off, and they returned to Constantinople in a victorious procession.
Yeah, and this was a pretty big W, of course, for Harald himself, but also for Michael IV, a victory over the Bulgar rebels. Certainly something to bring back home, be proud of, lead a procession through the city. That'll get the people excited.
Harald was hailed as the brave burner of the Bulgars, while the pallid, sickly emperor wavered on his horse.
Yeah.
He died soon after. His adopted son was crowned Emperor Michael V, and the Golden Court became a corrupt garden of sycophants, possessed by the paranoia of the emperor. Michael sent men to attack Harald, but he and the Varangians killed the imperial assassins. Neither did Michael V trust Zoe. In truth, he had once thought to make a bride of his adoptive mother, but she was now over 60 and could bear him no heir.
Right, and to be fair, I mean, they're framing this in a very particular way, and I get it. Zoe had held a lot of power during the reign of Michael IV, and that was something that Michael IV had been concerned about, but she ended up outliving him. And so Michael V comes to power, and he certainly is a paranoid fella, but it's not entirely unwarranted. He is suspicious of Zoe, her power games, how she can sort of pull the strings behind the scenes, because that is kind of what she was doing. She did hold a lot of influence, and not to spoil too much, but she would continue to hold a lot of influence. And we see Harald getting involved here. Now, you know, the Varangian Guard is supposed to be this sort of non-political guard serving the Emperor. They serve only who pays them, but if you're that close to court politics, palace politics, sometimes you're gonna get involved. Sometimes you're forced to choose a side. And so we're now seeing this conflict break out between Michael V and Zoe, and of course Harald holds a place of power. He holds a position of power with the Varangian Guard, just the pure physical force. He's got to decide what to do.
He had Zoe arrested, hastily convicted of attempting to poison him, and it was written, he dared to cut the hair off Zoe as though she was a common whore, and to banish her to an island in chains, where she was forced to become a nun. The people were outraged. Mobs formed at the feet of pillared palaces. Michael V brooded in his quarters, tormented by their shouts of derision, their love of Zoe. He arranged for the return of the former empress, and forced the captive Zoe to implore the crowds to accept him as their emperor. The people were not swayed by this gesture. Crowds stormed the palace, and Harald...
It shows you how, you know, as emperor, of course you were someone with a very high level of power, but no one has absolute power, and sometimes emperors lacked a lot of power. I mean, being in Constantinople, you were, on some level, at the whim of the people, the whim of the quote-unquote mobs of Constantinople. Now, if you had allies in other quarters to draw on, then you could resist the mob, you could fight back, but if it's you, the unpopular Michael V versus the popular, powerful Zoe, pulling the strings behind the scenes with a lot of different allies, then you can see that you, as emperor, begin to lose a lot of your power, and Michael V is left in a pretty bad position.
Harald and his men joined the rebellion. They cut down the palace guards, overran the royal quarters, and the mobs looted the gold, fine tapestries, and silk therein. Emperor Michael was found cowering in a monastery, pleading that he had relinquished the throne and taken monastic vows. The people dragged him from the altar to the walls of Constantinople. And there the Norse sagas recorded it was Harald of Norway himself who emerged to sate the mob's cries for blood. He pulled up the writhing and hysterical Michael V, and with his dagger he plucked out his eyes. The emperor wailed and bled at the feet of this Viking, and Michael was then said to have been castrated. Then he was banished to a monastery where he died a few months later.
Yeah, so how about not getting involved in politics, huh? Seems like Harald is getting a little bit involved in politics. But that's exactly what I'm saying. Sometimes you're left with no option. It's not like Harald and the Varangian Guard could have been completely non-political there. I mean, you're literally stuck in a situation where it's one person, Michael V, versus another, Zoe, the Emperor versus basically an Empress. You've got to make a choice. Clearly there was a better choice in this situation, and, you know, Harald certainly took a central position in this whole drama. He didn't necessarily need to do that much. He could have taken a step back, but he was already involved, and I suppose he decided that he was going to be a main character. It shows you how big a role these Varangians could play at times. And Michael V, even though he swore he had already taken monastic vows, he was faced with the fairly typical punishment of being blinded I think the castration was just a little extra on top of that. Of course, castration can prevent you from fathering any children, prevent you from forming your own dynasty, and the blinding was an alternative to execution. It was seen, I suppose, as more merciful in the Christian Byzantine Empire. We don't kill our opponents. We don't kill those who have a claim to the throne. We just blind and castrate them. Seems pretty brutal to us, but it was pretty common practice, though. As we see, Michael didn't live much longer after that.
In time, the throne would be restored to Zoe. Some believed the Empress longed for Harald, and yet Zoe would marry another lover, a man over 20 years her junior. If Harald had washed his blade in the blood of royals, there were yet other kings to slay.
Oh, yeah.
The throne of Norway was sat upon by the bastard son of his dead brother, and counseled by traitors to his house. Harald would have his vengeance.
To be continued. My goodness, that was an excellent, excellent video. Like I said, when you look at the Vikings, you can really see them many different places and times throughout Europe. If you follow them around, you get a pretty good look at European history. You get to see, of course, the Norse peoples of Scandinavia. You get to see the expanding Kievan Rus. You see the Normans, who, of course, played a big role in France and England, but even beyond that, they were always marching around and conquering different lands. You get to see Constantinople with the Varangian Guard. I mean, the Vikings were really everywhere at this time period, and following Harald, you get a good taste of everything he was involved in. This is his time in Constantinople. I know a little bit about that part of Harald's story, because I know a bit about Byzantine history of this period. And of course, there are other aspects of Harald's story that I know a bit about. Look, I don't know too much about European history of this era, but Harald is a very prominent character, so it's kind of difficult not to know a little bit about him. But yeah, History Dose did a fantastic job with this video. They really know how to get the drama, really cinematic, really dramatic. Like I said, the story reads more like a fantasy novel. I feel like I'm reading, or I'm playing one of the Witcher games or something, but we're getting a look at Harald's biography. Truly, truly remarkable. So if you guys enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Like I said, this video was recommended, or requested, I should say, by a patron, so thank you so much for the support. And if you guys would like to see exclusive content or request videos, if you subscribe at a high enough tier, then go and check out the Patreon. It is linked down below. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.